on primacy rules for service conflicts and revenue stacking for flexibility services, where you'll be hearing about the latest developments in each of these work areas operating under the Open Networks program. My name is Reese Breen-Begaden, and I am the Technical Project Manager for the ENA's Open Networks program, and I will be the chair for today's session. So before I give an overview of today's agenda, I just want to briefly cover some housekeeping points. So if anyone has any issues with connectivity or whatnot throughout the session, these are the dial-in details that you can use to log in via your phone. We ask that everyone keeps their microphone muted just to avoid background noise unless you have a question. We do welcome questions throughout the session, although there is a specific kind of agenda item for open discussion at the end. So we'll do our best to kind of pick the questions up as they come through. But if there are too many, we'll have should have enough time at the end to cover what needs to be covered. As I said previously, this session will be recorded and made publicly available on our ENA's YouTube channel. So please do turn off your video if you don't want your likeness to be recorded and shared. The slides for this webinar will also be made publicly available on the ENA's website. So please do keep an eye out for that. And as usual, if you have any comments, feedback for us, please send that to us via the standard Open Networks mailbox you can see there on screen. So in terms of agenda for today, after my bit, we'll kick the session off with Javier Ford, the head of Open Networks, giving a brief overview of the journey we've taken so far to get where we are today. And then we'll get into the core content of today's session with an overview of the revenue stacking content from our working group lead, Alex Howard from UKPN, followed by an overview of the Primacy Rule Framework report from Crispy Collins and Hannah Spurgeon from Baringa, who we have commissioned to support us with the development of this new framework. Then Evangelos from UKPN, our Primacy Working Group lead, and Edwin Tamas Williams from NISO will talk a bit about the next steps for implementation in this increment of primacy rules. Before finally concluding the core part of the webinar with Matt Watson, who will be talking about the handover of this work from the Open Networks program to Alexon as the market facilitator, hopefully leaving us all enough time for a decent amount of open discussion and Q&A. So I hope everyone's all right with that. Unless there's any immediate questions, I'll hand over to you, Avi, for quick context setting and recap.
Thanks, Reese. And thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. And I've used this opportunity to give a quick recap of this journey because I do see quite a lot of familiar names on call today and a few who are not as well. So while we are going to be talking about state of play and what we've done in the recent past, obviously this has been a journey for a few months and years now. So I wanted to reflect on some of the key learnings and how we've managed to incorporate that in the content of work we're presenting today. I think when we started this journey way back in, I think 2.5, 3 years ago, our approach was essentially looking at primacy in the first instance, exploring all the permutations out there that could lead to a potential development of rules for primacy. And as we went down this journey, and like I said, it's been a long one, some of the observations we've had was that the use case approach that we had originally undertaken was not fast enough. And whilst when we kicked off the journey, the conversation of primacy and stackability were, important, but not necessarily as urgent as it is now. But as things have emerged and the uptake of markets and just the awareness has increased, so it is far more important and urgent now. So we had taken that on board and moved away from the use case approach to a framework approach that is part of the agenda today as well. Some of the other learnings that we had was that primacy and stackability, while we were approaching them as two separate areas of work, it became clear to us that from working in the network space and speaking to the stakeholders that they're perhaps different sides of the same coin. So we need to think of it that way and even speak of it that way. And that's the reason we are approaching our work and the webinar in a fashion where we're speaking both of those topics in together and talking about network and flexibility, coordination as a whole rather than individual specific topic of flex primacy and flex stackability as a separate topics. I guess last but not least is that one of the things we've learned over the past few years is the fact that this is a considerably complex and a huge challenge to deal with. So it's unlikely that we go away in a month or two and everything's sorted on the ground. So we needed to think of an approach where we can take this in phases and deploy them as we are developing as well. So Originally the intention was to go away and work out on use case by cases basis and identify what data sets are needed to deploy it. But somewhere along the way, looking at our pace and the need of the hour, we sort of pivoted around, here's the data sets available, what can you then do with it, and then look at what other activities needs to be performed to identify data sets for the other use cases. Well, this is a high kind of a quick reflection of where we were, and these are the key kind of considerations that were implemented by the working group within the Open Networks program that each of the colleagues following myself will be talking about. So hopefully that's a quick whistle stop tour for 3 years of our journey, I suppose, but talking to the nuances and the challenges we've been facing and hopefully the solutions to them. I hand over to the next speaker, who's Alex, will be talking about the stackability aspect of our work. Over to you, Alex.
Super. Thank you very much, Abby. Reese, if you can move on the slides one more. So my name is Alex Howard. I lead the flexibility markets team at UK Power Networks, and together with Will Seward at NISO, I led the stacking working group in 2024. Now, I'm going to talk about stacking, and colleagues are going to talk about primacy afterwards. As Avi mentioned, we got strong feedback last year that stakeholders wanted us to present a joined up picture of what's going on here across stacking and primacy. And so I just wanted to spend 2 minutes at the start kind of setting out how these things are related and how they're different. So both stacking and primacy it can be thought of as sets of rules for how we coordinate activity across multiple markets. So NISO by services, DSOs by services, there are wholesale electricity markets. So these stacking and primacy rules sit across those markets and govern what is possible. Now, the distinction between the two and kind of how we've organized ourselves within open networks over the past couple of years have been that stacking rules cover the services that any single asset can provide. So if we look at the map on the left-hand side, if you own or operate asset A, then the stacking rules tell you what combination of services can you provide from that asset. Similarly, asset B and asset C. Where primacy is different is primacy looks at not just what can you do in isolation, but how do we govern the coordination between assets, and particularly assets that are connected to the same electricity network. So for example, if NISO needs asset A or asks asset A to turn up its demand, and the DSO wants asset B to turn down its demand, primacy covers how we deal with those conflicts of requirements and make sure that both the national and local systems remain reliable, safe, and efficient. So both stacking and primacy affect how much money you can make from a flexible asset. Stacking rules will probably be more obvious and more front of mind for flex providers. They effectively govern what you can put your asset forward to participate in. Primacy rules will often be invisible to flex providers, but happening behind the scenes through exchanges of data between DSOs and NISO to make sure that the combination of actions across these markets results in an efficient outcome. So if we then dive into stacking, just wanted to start by a kind of short reminder about why this matters, why Open Networks set up a working group on this in the first place. And that's, in short, we need stacking in order to hit our decarbonisation targets. So for Clean Power 2030, for beyond, we need a lot more flexibility. So NISO and DESNZ have estimated that we need to go from around 2.5 gigawatts of consumer-led flexibility today to around 12 gigawatts in 5 years' time. That's a kind of 4 or 5 times growth. And if we don't get stacking right, we will need a whole lot more redundant flexibility that's not doing things for a lot of the time in order to cover our requirements at peak demand. We'll also end up rewarding each of those units of flexibility less if they're not able to stack and move between markets efficiently. So not only do we end up needing more flexibility, but we end up with a worse business case for each bit of flexibility. Conversely, if we can continue to build progress on stacking, we can get this kind of virtuous circle of actually improving the business case for flexibility, particularly distributed flexibility, and reducing the amount of kind of redundancy that we need to keep the system running. Now, we presented on progress a couple of times in 2024, and some of the people on the call may have dialed in for those sessions. What we heard on stacking specifically was try and keep things simple. Let's make clear that kind of link to primacy and kind of what this means in the round for flex providers. We heard that from some stakeholders, this is still pretty unclear and we need better communications. We need kind of real clarity on what's possible and what's not. And we heard from other stakeholders, no, we get that. We understand the rules. We just want those rules to be more permissive, to allow us to stack more in more circumstances. And the last thing we heard was we need to kind of think bigger on stacking. So kind of rather than thinking a year at a time and kind of what can we achieve in the next X months, we needed a plan that would kind of take us further into the future. And I think Matt from Alexon will talk a little bit about what the market facilitators plans are beyond 2025, which will hopefully address that point. So if we go on to the next slide. So where did we get to last year? So the first thing that we did was we looked across all of the DSO products, which have been standardized early 2024, and said, is there an opportunity to reduce the number, to reduce the complexity, and therefore make stacking easier? And we identified 3 products out of those 12 that actually were redundant, where the system operators knew that actually they could procure those services in a different, more standard way. And so we're now down to 9 products and always looking for opportunities to reduce that further. We have introduced guidance on all of the products that exist across NISO and DSO markets. So if you go to the ENA website, you'll find a big spreadsheet which has 18 different flexibility products in kind of columns along the top, and then 30 or 40 rows of properties of those services, technical requirements for those services that should allow you to kind of filter what can my asset participate in before you get then into the question of, can I do service 1 and service 2 together? On that, we published a tool, and there's a screenshot from it on the right-hand side, which allowed you to pick any combination of 2 services and understand what was the kind of authoritative guidance agreed across NISO and the DSOs in terms of how stackable those are. And we break that out into kind of 3 different types of stacking. So the first is co-delivery. So this was this idea that actually through the same action, the same kilowatt, the same kilowatt hour, you could be paid twice, potentially by different system operators. So if NISO require demand turn down through the DFS, at the same time that the DSO requires demand turned down in order to manage local congestion on the network, then actually co-delivery would indicate, is it possible for a single asset to provide both of those services and get paid twice? Splitting was the next one, where we looked at where people have assets that are not fully utilized. So maybe you have a 5 megawatt battery storage unit, and the DSO needs 2 megawatts of that capacity to manage local congestion. Is it possible to then sell the other 3 megawatts of that asset to NESO? So to split the capacity of a single asset between different markets. And then the last one that we looked at was around jumping. So this ability to kind of move between services over time in an efficient way. So for all of those 18 services, you'll find those rules have been taken from the participation guidances for all those various services. They've been vetted by the NESO, vetted by the DSOs as accurate, and then included in this tool. So hopefully you need to go to one place, not kind of dive into what was the service guidance published 4 years ago and is that the latest version, etc., to know what's possible and what's not. We had lots of discussions about changing the rules for existing services. And often we ran up against barriers around doing that, around not undermining existing delivery of services by making changes to existing operational products. But what we did agree, again, across NESO and all the DSOs, was some core principles for any new services and any changed services to ensure that those services are more stackable by default. So recognizing the fact that it's easier to change these services at the start than kind of once they're operational, we want to make sure that anything new that gets released meets these kind of minimum criteria. And I'll talk a bit about what those criteria are on the next slide. Then the last thing to flag, which hopefully lots of you on the call will have seen, was that NESO updated its demand flexibility service last year. And one of the key changes that they introduced was, rather than saying you need to commit to either DFS or other services for the whole season, we will allow you to participate in DFS and DSO services and actually get paid for both. So that's the kind of co-delivery box there that you can see on screen. For DFS and DSO services went from red to green last year. And so for a lot of distributed flexibility active in those markets, that's hopefully a positive change and a sign of things to come. If we go to the next slide, Reese. So I think there's been a little bit of communication about this over the last few days, but a lot of you probably haven't seen that we published a joint statement between NESO and the DSOs confirming why we think stacking is important and that actually this needs to be a core consideration in the design of new and changed services. We focused initially on ensuring that services are splittable. So this idea that if you've got some capacity, you can provide some to the NESO, some to the DSO, and can jump between services at different times. And so the 7 principles that we've agreed are laid out in kind of shorthand here, but I'd also encourage people to look at the slightly longer statement. It's only a couple of pages, which sets out actually why we think these things are important, and how, if we get these things right in future, it will make stacking a lot easier for flex providers. I won't read through all of them now, but kind of a couple of the key ones perhaps to highlight are One, to make sure that we're explicit when we launch new services or make changes, what the impact of that is on stacking. So keeping some of those materials that I talked about before up to date, the revenue stacking tool, the technical requirements, etc. Perhaps a kind of slightly technical example, but the kind of penalization of over delivery. This was something that stakeholders flagged as an issue in some services where actually they'd like to split capacity between two services, but that would mean that even if those services delivered in the same direction, so they're both turning up demand or both turning down demand, they'd get penalized by one of the services for over delivering, providing too much flexibility, because when DSOs or NISO do their count of what's been delivered, they're looking at what you've delivered against service 1 and service 2 at the same time. And if we go to the next slide. And this is my last slide. And it's worth saying before I kind of dive into this that Open Networks has handed over responsibility for the stacking work stream to the market facilitator. And so actually the kind of key message from this slide is actually, please listen to what Matt Watson says from Alexon kind of in the second half of this webinar, because he'll talk about kind of where next and the kind of bigger picture for stacking. But I'd encourage anyone who hasn't kind of dug into what we delivered in 2024 to explore the ENA website. We've tried to kind of reorganize stuff so it makes a bit more intuitive sense to people. There's links embedded in the slide, which I will drop into the chat once I finish speaking. Keep an eye on what's going on in the baseline working groups. This is another work stream within Open Networks. And one of the things that we're looking at within that is, can we simplify and standardize the baselines that are used across DSO services and use that as a route to taking down some of the barriers that stop stacking at the moment. So one of the things we identified last year as an issue was a lot of services rely on historic baselines. So what did this asset do over the last 10 similar days? And if assets are moving between services and being dispatched one day for the DSO, one day for the NISO, they can end up with a baseline that doesn't reflect their business as usual profile. So one of the things that baselining working group is looking at is, can we move to a simpler set of baselines that don't have this kind of drawback of service 1 undermining your ability to participate and get paid fairly for service 2. We're going to embed those stackable by default principles. So NISO is already working about kind of how can they embed that within their wider set of market design principles. They included some of that within their markets roadmap, but I think kind of watch this space on kind of how that then feeds into new services from NISO. And also Alexon will be looking at kind of how their role in kind of designing or approving new services can reflect these stacking principles. And then the last thing to flag, which I'm sure Matt will kind of talk about a bit later, is this vision for market coordination. So kind of taking what we've done up a level, bit of a step back, kind of where are we trying to get to over the next kind of 2 years or so. I think the first workshop on that is in the next couple of weeks, I think on the 15th of May. So if you have an interest in this space, and particularly if you feel, yeah, this is great, but there's a bigger opportunity here, which I want to unlock for my company or my customers, then please do engage in that next step in the process. I'll stop at this point. Reese, are we taking questions as we go, or are we storing them up for the end?
If there's any immediate questions, we have probably enough time for maybe one or two. But equally, there's time at the end. Cool. Yeah, if people need more time. Oh, Nina, please. You may be on mute if you're speaking.
Sorry, just getting the tech there. Is that all right?
Yep.
Cool. I was just gonna ask, and maybe if this is too existential a question, no worries. You talked about the fact that we used to see kind of stacking and primacy as a bit separate, and then you got this feedback that actually they need to be thought more about together and in the round and as two sides of the same coin. So we've kind of undergone a paradigm shift in our thinking there about how to go about seeing these things. And I guess I wondered if we're already have any ideas about what the next paradigm shift might be of bringing those things closer together. And if we're thinking about like market co-design and co-procurement, is that something that's might be the next paradigm shift, or is something else the next paradigm shift? Like, where do we think we might end up here? Because I know some of your feedback on the right hand side, Alex, you said people were telling you to think a bit longer term, like, do we know what we don't know yet?
I think the honest answer is no, we probably don't have a kind of well-agreed vision for kind of where this goes next. I don't know if Matt wants to come in terms of how much this is kind of in scope or not of the kind of next phase of work that Alexon will run.
Yeah. Do we know what the next paradigm shift is? Probably not at this stage, because inherently otherwise we already be. But I think, yeah, I guess the kind of the understanding things need to be tied together. Ultimately, they are like having them framed as two different elements is useful, because there are still constraints and things we need to manage that cover both sides. The kind of how do you make things accessible for kind of one asset, and the kind of do the sort of more coordination between assets, but acknowledging the interlinkages is absolutely there, and kind of working out how you do things. I guess in our work we will be looking forward at kind of what the vision is. One of the challenges we're trying to, I guess, grapple with at the moment is how far to go out into the future, because the challenge is if you go too far, there's a chance we just end up talking for quite a long time and not actually delivering. So there's a kind of real balance we're trying to strike there on how do we set a vision whilst also acknowledging we need to kind of deliver. And I think that's something we're still working through on, kind of how we go around some of these different pieces. Ultimately, market coordination is super important. I guess the view is how do we make sure we can make clear progress in the short to medium term. I think there is a kind of vision setting piece as well, but it's trying to kind of set that at the right level so we don't spend, a year talking about what things could happen, then another couple of years doing impact assessments, and then kind of things kind of drag on and on and on. So, and that's something we're kind of grappling with at the moment, is kind of how to set that bound. I guess one of the key bits we're trying to work out is what do people think good looks like, because I think across different spaces I'm getting quite different views from that. So I think there's some interesting things that are coming out of Europe about where things could go, whether you have, like I say, kind of co-procurement, whether you have things like bid forwarding. There's all sorts of interesting things coming out of there. Equally, some other things come out of other projects kind of coming out about what good could look like. So I think part of it will be trying to set out where do we think things should go, but trying to hopefully not go too big so we can actually keep moving and making progress. But yeah, this is going to be part of the fun discussion we're going to be having in our work on market coordination. And Alex was right, the first working group on that is on the 15th. But yeah.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for the responses, everyone. Given the time, I think we'll move on to the next agenda item. So I think I'm handing over to you, Chris, first, and then Hannah to talk about the overview of the primacy framework report.
Thanks, Reese. Yeah, so we're just here to talk about the primacy piece of work that Baringa were asked to support ENA in developing. So I think Alex has gone into some detail about the distinction between stackability and primacy. Might just reiterate a few points around that. So I think if stackability is something that's from the lens of the flexibility provider, that you can see what services you can simultaneously or collectively participate in. Primacy is more from the point of view of the system operators. So understanding when there is a conflict between two actions that the NISO and the DSO want to take, how they reconcile that, who moves first, who takes precedence over the other. And it tends to be more in the operational timescales, sort of within day, that we're thinking about how these rules play. So on the assumption that the stackability criteria have been met, there still may be situations where there needs to be some resolution in those operational timescales. So we were asked to come in and do a review of the primacy rules that have been considered to date. And as Avi mentioned, this has been in discussion for maybe 3 years. We only came in sort of half a year ago, sort of to pick up all the good work that had been done before that, and try to bring it together and where possible simplify things to identify what the key fundamental features of the network, features of primacy rules, features of conflict cases are, so that we can have something that can then be understood and then implemented. And I think that's what we were aiming to do. So we'll talk in a bit more detail about those primacy rules and those conflict cases. And then the purpose was to do a cost-benefit analysis to understand, for a given conflict situation, which of the different primacy rules made most sense for really the system as a whole, both technically and also sort of economically finding the best outcome. So there is a report that is now publicly available. Maybe Rhys can put the link if he hasn't already. And in that report, what we've tried to put out is some definitions of primacy rules, which we'll cover in a second, and rules that are generic enough that they can be enduring, noting that there are different services that NISO procures, different services that the DSOs procure, and that those evolve over time. We didn't want to get locked into a situation that what we were asserting was contingent on the specifics of those services. We wanted to make sure that it was something that could be applicable regardless of the details of how those services are being defined. We defined 4 conflict cases. So these are the sort of network situations, or the types of actions that NISO and DSO want to take that may be in conflict with each other. The initial list of conflicts was very long. That's primarily because there was an attempt originally to map every NISO service to every DSO action, and you can sort of see how that can blow up quite quickly. So that was the kind of the key output of this, was to reduce that down to 4 fundamental conflict cases that we could with some simplifying assumptions still sort of learn something useful out of the process. And then, as I say, we developed the CBA to understand which primacy rule led to the best whole system outcome under each of those conflict cases. And then finally, we just developed some initial considerations for the implementation of those primacy rules, the data that would be needed, the communication channels, the principles, the governance, the rules around how that would be implemented, although the CBA was the focus of what we were doing. So then if we just move on to the next slide, these are the sort of high-level primacy rules that we were considering. I will just take us through them. And I'll try to explain what they are in case it's not immediately obvious. So the no primacy rule was effectively our baseline against everything else. And it may just be worth just explaining what we mean when we're talking about these conflicts and what the no primacy baseline would result in. So there's a few definitions we introduced just to make this simpler, but it doesn't mean we need to talk in a slightly funny language. So there are effectively 2 types of constraint the DSO is faced with. Most DSO services, flexibility services, relate to thermal constraints on the distribution network. So megawatts or MVA being at risk of exceeding the rated capacity of network assets. And that can come either as a result of an export constraint, when there's an excess of generation that's sort of pushing up against the thermal limits of the network, or an import constraint when there's an excess of demand that isn't offset by enough generation locally, that can similarly, from the network's point of view, threaten to breach the thermal capacity of the network. So those are sort of the 2 constraint situations. And then we talk about what we call positive flexibility and negative flexibility. The positive flexibility just means effectively generation turn up but also demand turned down, because from a sort of a system point of view, they're tantamount the same thing. And then negative flexibility is the opposite of that. So that's demand turn up or generation turn down. So effectively, and my colleague Hannah is going to go into more detail about sort of how these interact, how these network constraints interact with these flexibility actions. But just to give you an example of the kind of constraints or the situations of conflict that we're concerned about that primacy rules need to address, A&M is quite a good example of what can happen here. Now, what we'll talk about doesn't just have to be about A&M. So A&M is active network management. So this is when there is a independently controlled or autonomous control of assets on the distribution network, so that if the network becomes constrained, their export or import potentially will flex automatically. So it's a form effectively of the DSO flexing the assets. And just to give you an illustration of the kind of conflict we're talking about, if the distribution network is export constrained, so there's an excess of generation on the distribution network, a point on the network, a primary substation, secondary substation, whatever it may be, is at or approaching its thermal limits, the A&M will be managing the generation and potentially demand below that constraint to make sure that that thermal limit isn't breached. So effectively, under those circumstances, the DSO is already taking flexibility actions to keep that sort of net generation on the network within the limits. Under that situation, if the NESO then tries to procure positive flexibility, let's say generation turn up, if nothing else happened, if the A&M weren't doing its job, that would breach the rated capacity of the network and cause a risk of thermal related outage. What happens in practice, though, is that the A&M will unwind that action. So that's really the kind of conflict situation we're talking about here. A NESO action trying to procure generation turn up from a constrained part of the network, leading to a counteracting generation turn down action effectively by the DSO via the A&M system. So I think that's reasonably should be reasonably clear why that happens and why that's a conflict situation. What's also a conflict situation is the opposite. So you're still in an export constrained situation, but now the NESO wants negative flexibility. It wants generation turned down. Now, sort of on its face, that doesn't seem like a conflict situation, because actually that wouldn't breach the thermal capacity of the network. All you're doing is creating additional headroom. It should be fine. But because of the way the A&M system operates, it will tend to see that headroom and soak it up by turning up generation from one of the other assets that's already being curtailed. So unless something else is done, you'll still get a conflict in that situation, because the A&M doesn't know that the NESO is trying to procure generation turn down and will simply unwind it. So those are both situations where there is a conflict occurring, but maybe you'll see that the resolution of that is quite different. And that's where we'll get into these primacy rules and see how they play out. So just to very quickly just talk through what the primacy rules then are. DSO primacy is effectively our way of saying under this situation, if there were a conflict, the DSO would have the right to tell the NESO not to procure flexibility from really any asset in that constrained part of the network. And the NESO would then need to procure its flexibility from elsewhere, noting that the NESO generally can procure flexibility from a pretty broad pool of potential providers. NESO primacy still has to respect the distribution network constraints, but under NESO primacy, the DSO creates the necessary conditions for the NESO to be able to procure that flexibility from assets within that area. And the specifics of what that looks like depend on the nature of the constraint. But effectively, you can think about the NESO either creating headroom ahead of time to make sure the NESO has access to the flexibility it needs from those assets on the distribution network, or it's doing something in real time, for example, modifying the logic behind the A&M system to make sure that this unwinding action doesn't automatically happen. Again, different ways of implementing that and different technical challenges associated with doing that, and also different legal, regulatory, contractual implications for those assets in those zones that are being curtailed. And then just the final type of primacy is joint primacy. This wasn't something we really explicitly looked at. Effectively, joint primacy is saying, rather than presupposing whether DSO primacy or NISO primacy is the optimal outcome, it could vary under certain circumstances depending on sort of the liquidity of the different markets. You solve that in real time between the DSO and the NISO through sort of very real-time data exchange, but also market signals to indicate who are the winners and losers of different rules, and an exchange of value between NISO and ESO and the DSOs to make sure that everyone's made whole. So it's sort of a conceptual best outcome, if you like, under all circumstances. You'd have joint primacy. We excluded it partly because it is almost a subset of NISO primacy, but also because it's probably a next step further down the line in terms of the data and commercial arrangements that have to be in place. So really our focus is on DSO primacy versus NISO primacy, both compared against sort of the baseline of no primacy. So that's a bit of a setup. I will just hand over then to Hannah to talk through sort of the CBA aspects of this and how these primacy rules interact with these conflict cases.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Reese. Perfect. So as Chris covered in some detail there, we used our definitions of NISO, positive and negative flexibility, and the kind of state of the distribution network either being export constrained, so the DNO or the ANM is close to or is affecting negative flexibility, or the case where the DNO is close to affecting positive flexibility, to simplify the conflict cases that could exist, coming up with this kind of grid of 4 conflict cases, which we then analyze to understand the impact of DSO and NISO primacy. So the first conflict case is where the NISO is dispatching positive flexibility, and that causes a conflict when the DNO counters that NISO action with negative flexibility. For example, the NISO has procured a turn-up service, but then in observing this, the DNO could turn something down to manage a thermal constraint, thereby causing a conflict in the network needs. And this kind of goes round across the table, where in case 2, when the NISO is procuring negative flexibility, the DNO could cause that there could be a conflict caused there with the NISO action absorbing that newly created headroom. So in each of these cases, we conducted a CBA to understand what would occur when DSO primacy or NISO primacy was enacted, and that helped us understand which rule might work better in each of these conflict cases. So Reese, if we go on to the next slide, we found through following the lines of costs that occur in each primacy rule that when the NISO action moves the loading of the network into a constraint, therefore exacerbating it, it's unlikely that NISO primacy makes economic sense across the system. And that's driven because there needs to be this creation of additional headroom on the distribution network, which means a cost for either the DNO in creating that headroom or the curtailed party. And furthermore, this example resulted in a drop of the overall generation capacity on the system, which NISO would then be obliged to address at a system level, which would mean redispatching an asset elsewhere, which would come at a cost economically, but also could come at a cost to the system in terms of carbon emissions, because if we're redispatching an asset elsewhere, it's highly likely to have to be something like a gas turbine. And so given that, we found that, yeah, when the NISO action is loading into that constraint, so conflict case 1 and conflict case 2, the optimal approach is actually likely to be DSO primacy. But there is changes which would be needed to be made to enable this to actually happen. So at a high level, that DSO primacy, when the conflict is happening into a constraint, would require the DNO to inform the NISO that the local network will be constrained at a period of time, which means that the DNO needs an ability to make a robust forecast of the constraint location level curtailment for kind of the next day, and then to be able to communicate this forecast to the NISO. The frequency and reliability of those data exchanges will impact how this primacy rule can be implemented in the future, which I know Evangelos and others will be covering later. So I won't go into too much detail there. But the DNOs, for example, could update their forecast based on data received from the NISO, but depending on when it's received will change how the primacy rule will actually need to be implemented. So that's where we got to on where the conflict case happens into a constraint. In the cases 2 and 3, so this is where the DSO is countering a NISO action with either positive or negative flexibility, which absorbs headroom. So the conflict is happening in the language that we've covered out of a constraint. The optimal approach turned out to be NISO primacy. And this was on the assumption that A&M systems can be modified to allow this change to be made to stop the DSO absorbing the newly created headroom, and that this can be conducted, that those A&M systems can be changed technically and within reasonable costs. Noting all the A&M systems across different DNOs are different, but obviously we worked with the working group to walk through this report and had a number of conversations with A&M engineers within the DNOs and found that it seemed to be technically reasonable to assume this could be made, whilst I know further work needs to go into understanding the true cost of making those changes and the applicability on different types of A&M system. We also found that when currently, because the A&Ms are not yet widely used to manage import constraints, currently not all the DNOs are monitoring constraints in like a really real-time way. So it's not currently in the ways of working to adjust a DSO dispatch with the level of granularity that would be needed to enact this primacy rule. And so that's another kind of change that would need to be conducted. And when it comes to exporting, we know that the implementation will rely on the A&M being instructed to not unwind NISO conditions, to not unwind NISO actions. And so therefore there's some more investigation required to the A&M systems to be able to enact those primacy rules. So noting time, Reese, I think we might have run over, tried to cover that as quickly as possible. I don't know whether we want to take questions now or let Evangelos run through the implementation roadmap before.
Flo, is that all right with you if we can take questions at the end?
Yeah, it's less a question and just a point to say that it's worth looking at the ABCD project that was done with NGED, because so at least for our system, for Smart Grid Solutions StrataGrid, that the negative flexibility system has already been solved. Like, that's been demonstrated it can be done.
Oh, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, there was an innovation project on this.
Okay, well, we'll feed that back to the working group. Thanks for sharing that, Flo. Cool. Well, thanks, Chris and Hannah, for that portion of the session. Yeah, so over to, I guess, Evangelos to talk about primacy and the next steps.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Hannah and Chris, for the great outline of the report we developed on the new framework for developing primacy rules. So welcome everyone. My name is Evangelos Karagiannis. I'm the co-lead of the Primacy Technical Working Group. My colleague Ruben from NGET is on annual leave today, so I will guide through this. So as part of developing the slides for today's session, we thought that it's worth taking some stock of all the developments related to primacy so far, so that you have a full picture of where we are at the moment. So the Primacy and Conflict Resolution Working Group was created back in 2019 with the main aim of identifying whole system efficient solutions that mitigate against service conflicts on the one hand, but also facilitate wider transmission and distribution coordination on the other. So within that context, we had a lot of developing work in the early years from 2019 up until 2022. And at the end of 2022, we managed to publish a report with the increment 1 of primacy rules, which was approved in 2023. And we had the first two main use cases of resolution of service conflicts. The first one was the transmission constraint management, conflicting with DNO active power flexibility services. And this primacy rule is implemented by NISO and NGET and UKPN as part of the megawatt dispatch projects, which are currently live. And the second use case within increment 1 was a similar one, but concerned actions taken by NISO through the balancing mechanism, which conflict with, again, DNO active power flexibility services. This one was desktop tested by NISO and ENW and SPEN, and it's not fully implemented, although the testing was successful, because further development is needed on the data required and the data exchange system so that we can identify and mitigate conflicts on a real-time or close to real-time basis. For both of these primacy rules under increment 1, DSO primacy was selected as the preferred option, mainly due to the geographic constraints and less liquidity surrounding DNO flexibility services, which means that the DNOs have limited options or fewer options compared to NISO, which can explore other credible options due to no or limited geographic constraints and, of course, more liquidity in their markets. Following up on that work, as Christian and Hannah said, we had this framework report and increment 2 of primacy rules, which we approved earlier this year. And we changed a bit the approach, and this is now a framework-based conflict case development of primacy rules. And this allows for a more practical and scalable approach to develop primacy rules, since it's much easier to categorize use cases under the 4 main framework conflict use cases Christian and Hannah described, rather than going on a use case by use case basis and try to analyze everything on a single use case and then create the rules and then go to the next use case. At some point, I think we have identified more than 2,000 use cases, so that was not practical and feasible. So this is everything on the scene setting and where we are in terms of the approved rules. One of them is currently live under the Megawatt Dispatch project. And now we are working on the next steps and what we need in terms of implementing the remaining rule from increment 1, but also the new rules under increment 2. And my colleague from NISO Edwin, will cover how we are going to do that and what the next steps are to implement increment 2 of primacy rules. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks Evangelos. Yeah, I'm Edwin. I'm a flexibility development manager at NISO. So as Chris and Hannah mentioned, there's like a range of implementation considerations as we take the framework and apply it into practice, into our core services, and I'll touch on some of these now. The first point to make clear is that there's a range of ways and options for how we translate primacy into practice. So how does the framework actually flow through into specific decisions around contracting and dispatching flexibility? And to do this kind of development and considerations, we need to think about the data that we receive from DNOs about their constraints and the potential conflicts. So for example, what do we know from the DNOs about the likelihood of a constraint or a action being encountered by an A&M or DSO flex agreement? And at what time scale do we have information about this constraint? Is it settlement period by settlement period, or does it cover a longer period of time, for example? Similarly, we know we need to provide the right information about the assets we're contracting with to DNOs to enable them to send back information about potential conflicts. We then need to consider the data systems, so how often we exchange data with DNOs about potential conflicts. We'll have to consider the principles, and the DNOs will have to consider the principles of access rights and connections agreements where there are any changes to curtailment rates associated with primacy. Hannah touched on this earlier. And ultimately, reflecting that, we need to build the functionality in our auction systems, dispatch systems, etc., to embed these changes. And one of the key recommendations and next steps from the Baringa report is to better understand the prevalence of DNO and NISO conflicts. So how likely is it that flexibility service providers will have assets at risk of conflict? And having a more robust evidence base here about how likely these conflicts are will help us develop a proportionate and efficient primacy service design that will flow into the data requirements we have from the DNOs, the data exchange requirements, and at what time and how often we get this data from DNOs, and the system, like the IT system development requirements. We're carrying out analysis now across these different elements to inform an implementation roadmap for embedding primacy rules in our services. So while exactly how and when we implement primacy is subject to this analysis, we do expect there might be a case for building up the capability incrementally and learning by doing so, starting with some of the more simple versions of primacy before building more comprehensive, future-proof versions of the primacy. Thank you. So back to Evangelos.
Great, thanks, Edwin. So, as Edwin just said, a phased approach and learning by doing is the approach we are considering implementing. And because of the previous work the working group has done on this space, and the experience from the 2 megawatt dispatch projects from UK APN and NGED, we are thinking that the implementation of DSO primacy can start first, if we could somehow prioritize them. And of course, we are working closely with Election as the market facilitator to produce a clear and actionable handover report, which may inform the day one flexibility market rules of the market facilitator. And I think on that note, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Matt Watson from Election, to say a few words on the next steps from his side. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Evangelos. So, yeah, as Evangelos said, so I'm Matt Watson. I recently joined Alexon as a senior market design advisor. So I'm here to kind of look at all the different sort of flexibility market rules that we'll be developing. So what is it that we're going to be looking for the market to do over the coming years to try and kind of drive alignment and coordination. And as kind of been clear from the presentation so far, there's been a fair amount of work in this space so far across stacking and primacy. And yeah, I'm going to cover sort of how we see that fitting into the world of flex market rules going forward and how we try and take them forward. So this first slide is just, I guess, a bit of context setting on where we are with Market Facilitator. So I'm assuming most of you are aware that we were appointed the role of Market Facilitator. We've obviously had the consultation on our kind of policy framework. We are still awaiting the decision on that. So we're kind of very much in this sort of transition phase. This year kind of is very much the transition period where there's an awful lot of work going across a couple of different streams. The kind of top bits in that diagram are really all about governance. So there's a lot of work about how do we set up the Market Facilitator to succeed, how do we create the right governance to make sure we're delivering the right things for consumers. One point to kind of mention on that is that our consultation on the kind of the workshops about sort of our detailed design for the Market Facilitator launched yesterday. So if you are interested in that, please do kind of feed into that process around kind of how we're set up to succeed. The kind of bits in the sort of lighter pink purple piece are then more about the kind of details of around flexibility market rules. So if, like, whilst governance is really important to make sure we're kind of doing, we're kind of set up to do things in a transparent and kind of scalable manner, a lot of the detail and the value that's going to be created from the Market Facilitator is really around the flex market rules. Just for context, these flexibility market rules are effectively the things that system operators will be license bound to adhere to. I use that term very broadly because it's quite a broad thing. This is what we see within flexibility market rules. It can span from things like, you know, the standard agreement, which is, say, the T's and C's that they use to sign up to services to things like baselining methodologies, APIs potentially for dispatch. There's a whole range of different things that we can cover within these sort of market rules. And unsurprisingly, we're looking at kind of how do we transition those across from open networks? How do we continue to make progress this year? And then how do we kind of, what do we set out as our delivery plan for years 1 and 2 as we start up Market Facilitator kind of once we've got formal governance in place. So if you're interested in kind of what we're doing this year, we'll kind of touch on bits of it today, but equally there was a webinar. We published an interim plan about a month ago, comments on that plan close tomorrow. So if you've got any strong views on what we should or shouldn't be doing in this coming towards the end of the year, please feed into that process as well. And I guess the other bit around all this process, we're trying to, I guess, push to go live sort of at the end of this year. So this year is very much kind of build up and kind of build capacity, keep things moving. There is a kind of, you know, full formal governance then comes in towards the end of the year. But I guess from our perspective, we acknowledge we can't just sort of sit around, do nothing and think purely on governance. There's a lot about trying to make sure we are making progress in these various different spaces. The next slide, I think, then talks about kind of how we see revenue stacking and primacy rules fitting in together. And I guess the first bit is that we see the kind of market coordination, as we're kind of terming these pieces, as absolutely essential to what we do. So we have 3 core roles within the Market Facilitator on strategic leadership, market coordination, and implementation monitoring. So yeah, market coordination is pretty big in that. It's a key piece of that. And within, I guess, that broader definition of market coordination, we kind of see 2 kind of broad elements within it. So the first is really around kind of aligning the definitions of individual markets and kind of making sure we're clear and consistent about how those are defined. They're defined in a structured way, in a simple way that people can access. So I guess that's kind of individual markets, how they work, and I guess trying to reduce variation across them as well. So that might be through things like aligned metering requirements, settlement requirements, baselining, standard terms and conditions, things like that. But then we've also got the view on how do those sub-markets work next to each other. And that's really where kind of revenue stacking and primacy come in. So acknowledging there are multiple different sub-markets that are happening, whether it's DSOs procuring things for some of their products, NISA procuring some of their products. We've got to make sure that they sit nicely together and they aren't actively, or there isn't too much conflict between them, and that they are accessible across those. And that's very much where we kind of see this market coordination work. So the sort of diagram on the right is kind of picked up from some of the work we've been doing on kind of our framework for flexibility market rules. It's a slight amendment to a version that you may have seen previously. And I guess we kind of start off with wanting to kind of set out a really kind of clear overview of what the different markets are across GB in our flexibility markets catalogs. That'll be setting out what are the different markets, what are the requirements. Alex kind of alluded to some of the work that happened on the all products technical requirement piece that the open networks had pulled together, similar to that piece, being able to provide a really good overview of how the markets work. Ultimately, that is then built up of two sort of subcomponents. They're kind of definitions of how submarkets work. So that's saying, how do DSOs procure this product? This is how we're going to define how that works. So like a number of definitions. It might also include, say, for example, how does an ESO procure some of its services, so defining those markets, which will be built off some of our flexibility market rules, including some work on an end-to-end process, so we can kind of drive some common terminology across this and get some understanding of the different processes in the procurement operation of services, to kind of understand the differences and hopefully drive alignment in future, as well as some of the other market rules we're developing. So as I mentioned, things like metering, settlement, baseline, etc., would all sort of fit into that kind of how do we define sub-markets. And then we have this view of these kind of market coordination rules, which are then saying how do these markets work together. And yeah, that's very much what we see we'll be picking up from the good work on primacy and stacking so far, and feeding them into that piece and kind of how things sit together. In terms of like what that then means this year in terms of the work we're doing, I think the next slide then presents a kind of snapshot from our handover plan that we published earlier in the month. It's quite busy. There's an awful lot going on there. So I'll try and pick up a few of the key pieces that I think are particularly relevant. So I guess we've got the products in green, I guess, is the kind of work from open networks. We've got the products and revenue stacking work and primacy work there that we've talked about so far. Effectively, as Alex mentioned, products and revenue stacking has already been handed over to us. So effectively, we are now taking any work in that space forward, and we're effectively kind of taking that forward into this flexibility markets catalog, which is what we'll be doing to kind of deliver a kind of an overview of the various different markets, as well as a piece on the vision for market coordination. So that will be, as Alex mentioned, we're looking to do some work about kind of where things go next. So with primacy, with I guess products, kind of a natural stopping point in the stacking world, and with primacy very much focused on implementation, I guess it's an opportunity to see how those two things sit together going forward and where do we want to take them. And as I mentioned, really thinking about what does good look like and how do we make progress in the next, in the sort of short term between now and the end of the year, but then also in the kind of the sort of first 2 years of formal go live of Market Facilitator in our kind of first delivery plan. So really trying to understand where things go. The kind of view at the initial view at the moment is there's probably going to be a fair amount of focus on code delivery and how does that work in practice, given there's fairly good understanding of things like some of the other stacking pieces around jumping and splitting so far. There's a lot of, I guess, space to think about how does code delivery work going forward. Primacy will be feeding into that work as well. So just to make it very clear, market coordination is not just about stacking, it's about how the two things work together. How do we come up with a really coherent view of what good looks like? That process, because of the work that's still ongoing through open networks, is big handover a little bit later. Inherently, we want to make sure that we're not kind of stopping things unnecessarily, and there's still a fair amount of work that needs to be done on the implementation process and how do we kind of take the good framework that Baringa have pulled together and actually drive it into something that can be delivered and implemented. So handover for that is scheduled in May, and then effectively we'll be looking to try and take that forward. For all of these, I guess we are trying to set out a set of day one flexibility market rules. So those are the rules that people have to adhere to from effectively the start of Market Facilitator. That is very much just about getting a starting point, about kind of, I guess, translating where we are, making sure when we kind of take what are the rules that are currently being used by DSOs and NISO, and kind of making sure they apply going forward, plus delivering a few extra. But equally, it's about, I guess, beyond that, we expect this to be quite a dynamic space and to kind of see change. That's not about saying those are the final set of rules. That's, I guess, a starting point. And we'll look to kind of build more out through our enduring change process over time. So looking to build out more comprehensive rules in various different spaces. For kind of what we're going to be delivering in kind of those subsequent years, we will be kind of consulting later in this year around a delivery plan, which will be basically setting out over 26 and 27, what is it that we want to achieve in these various different spaces. And hopefully that kind of work on the vision for market coordination helped us direct where we'd like to go in that space. So my final slide, if that's kind of big picture, lots of different things, is just to kind of summarize where we think we are. So I guess from a primacy perspective, as Edwin and Evangelos mentioned, I guess we have the framework. There's now a fair amount of work that needs to be understood on the kind of implementation requirements. So we're going to be supporting that work to try and understand really what is required. Ultimately, for us to kind of be able to transition into a flexibility market rule, we need to be able to set out a formal implementation plan, and we need to have the sufficient detail to make sure that is workable. We want it, I guess, to be ambitious in terms of timeframes, but equally realistic. And so there's a kind of fine balance that we need to strike with that. Obviously, we need to hand over from the Open Networks Working Group and try and do that in a kind of smooth way possible to make sure we continue to move forward. We don't lose any momentum. We will be looking to develop the sort of day one flexibility market rules. That's what does primacy look like on day one, to make sure we're definitely at least capturing where we are from increment one. But ideally, we'd have a strong position on the implementation plan for increment two as well. But we'll see how progress goes on that. And then, as we mentioned, there's this kind of vision for market coordination work that is starting on the 15th. I think Rashmi put out a sign up for that. If you're interested, that's actually a sign up for all the different working groups we're taking forward at the moment. So if you're interested in getting involved in, I guess, in some of the details of what we're trying to deliver, please sign up and we'll add you to the various different working groups. I think that covers what I was going to say. So am I handing back to you, Rhys?
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. And thanks to all our speakers to doing their best to kind of keep on time. We have a decent amount of time now for kind of open discussion, any questions. So I appreciate those that have had questions throughout the session being patient, but now's your time to speak. So I guess we'll pause and allow those to come off mute or type in chat if there's any specifics that they have for any of the speakers here today. Nina.
You always just need someone to get things going, don't you? So hopefully I'm encouraging everyone else to get engaged, get interested, and ask some good questions. Because yeah, thanks so much for kind of presenting it. And really nice to see that segue over from ENA and going over to Lexon and that work being kind of taken up and having a bit of a rethinking about what our focuses and priorities are for delivery here. I think I've got a weird technical question. Surprise! Back to the slides that Hannah was presenting. When she was talking about the different cases. Yes.
This slide?
Yeah, that's fab. And apologies if this is a really irritating question and not a helpful thing to say, but I guess like just genuine curiosity and interest. So I kind of, when you're talking about, so next slide probably. When you're talking about areas where NISO has primacy, you talked about that as when they're moving out of a constraint and some headroom is being created on the network. The idea then is that NISO should have priority to go in and use that headroom. Have you thought about this from a network access rights issue point of view? Because I guess like I'm seeing nodding. So please, I'd love it explained to me. Because from a like hypothetical point of view, those assets in the A&M area, if the network is available, don't they have access rights to having that network? So why is it that the NISO is getting the rights, not them? Please educate me. Thank you.
Who's going to take that?
You go,
I'm talking.
Chris.
Okay.
I mean, controversially, I can, but if you want to go for it, Chris.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is spot on. You know, that is one of the things we spent, I think, 4 weeks specifically talking about. So you know, we were thinking about the CBA from a sort of whole system perspective. So I mean, one thing to note is that if you compare it to the no conflict case, then yes, the NISO taking a generation turndown action, creating headroom, and then effectively that is then opened up for a locally connected A&M customer, and as you rightly say, almost certainly they have access rights to it. under NISO primacy, effectively they would be not getting access to that. So they are losing out in that sense. I guess the other way of looking at it, though, is no primacy is not a sustainable situation. And what will really happen if you don't implement a primacy rule is that the NISO will stop procuring from that area because they're not getting the response they're expecting to see. So kind of in a perfect visibility world, that action wouldn't take place. So I totally agree that sort of contractually this may be a real challenge and a barrier to implementing this, and it may be that it can't be done retrospectively, that rights are rights and you can't get around that. It may instead be only applicable to new connections where some nuance can be put around that. Or it may be that there's some compensation that's required to account for the sort of opportunity cost of not being given access to that headroom. So yeah, it's definitely an important point. Both sort of the economics of it and also the practical and legal implications do need to be thought through. And I think that's something that falls under the implementation considerations. But no, it's by no means a small point that needs to be thought through. And I guess there's a sort of more general point, which is that if you connected to an area that wasn't constrained, and then that area becomes constrained, this is back to Alex's point. The problem with primacy is it's not always obvious to those flex participants that they are in a constrained zone. So there are some subtleties going on here that aren't necessarily fully visible to everyone about how much they might expect to be dispatched for a given service. So there are definitely these both kind of commercial and contractual considerations for flex providers that do flow from any implementation of the primacy work.
That does feel non-trivial, and interestingly, in your answer, you've actually made it more complicated. I'm glad Flo is here to save us, because not only are we now talking about network access rights, should it be the NISO or should it be the generator in the ANM that gets network access rights? Actually, in your explanation, kind of what you said is who has revenue rights, the asset connected in the ANM or the FSP that wants to provide, like, this is non-trivial.
I'm not sure I'm going to save it, but what I will say is that we did some consultancy work around when the Access SCR came in. And we looked quite carefully at what a lot of the existing contracts. So when a generator accepts an ANM contract, then there will be principles of access that are enshrined in those contracts. And I think it will surprise no one on this call to discover that across the DNOs, they've used different wording within. They may have all achieved relatively similar things. Most are operating on the last in, first out, but the wording and what exactly is enshrined is not quite the same. However, what is quite common and is most common is that the wording basically is saying that if you've joined after someone else, then you will be completely constrained before they are. And similarly, you wouldn't be constrained if someone above you in the stack is not. So it's looking at basically saying, and where this has been implemented through StrataGrid and the capability that we have from ABCD, is saying that if you were one of the earlier generators, then you basically have the right of your access. So if there's others in the stack that are not being constrained, then you could reduce your export but still maintain your access or maintain your rights to that access, because actually if others above the stack are not being constrained, then you would not be being constrained and you have the right to that export. So but again, there's been some consultancy that was done looking exactly at this, because we were looking at what the rights would be for example, dynamically shifting stack priority around in response to Access SCR. And we can look at what we can bring together of that and share with the working group. It was paid for consultancy, so I'll reach out to the people that commissioned it and see if they're happy for it to be shared to support this. But there is some work that's been done looking at it.
Thanks for that, Flo. I don't know, Gavin, if you were going to come in on this point particular. Sorry, Goran, I do realise you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to come to the point, particularly just that from my perspective is that NISO's creating the headroom in this instance. It's not a headroom that was there before. NISO's actions created the headroom, and therefore it wasn't there before. So thereby holding and not unwinding that action, it might not actually have that much of an impact on those curtailable connections. And from an access rights point of view, we've got the curtailment limits. So as long as we don't exceed them limits, we're not breaching the contract. And if we do, we can call upon flex services. So I think just thinking about it in that angle is that headroom wasn't there until NISO took that action. So I don't think it's quite the same as saying that we're taking that access away from the curtailable connection.
Yeah, which is why it wasn't showing up as a cost in our CBA. But it still may be a legal challenge depending on the wording. But yes, I agree, Gavin.
I think it depends if you so legally, retrospectively, it might be challenging because our previous contracts wouldn't have had a curtailment limit in it. But under SCR we do, so that, in my view, would give us more. I'm going to use the word fluidity within the contracts to be able to work around them limits. But again, we want to give our customers confidence in the values that they've been given. We don't want to change things afterwards. So I think just in terms of good customer service, we need to certainly engage with them on primacy and what it could mean for them when they're connecting. Sorry, this is my piece. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to wrap this up, Rhys, I think as it was pointed out in the next steps, it's one of the items that we will heavily review and consider, because it's not an easy answer which implementation option you should use on that front, and how this may impact older connections or connections pre or post SCR. So it's a matter of trying to have a universal view across the DNOs and try to find a solution that is beneficial at the end of the day for the whole system and the consumers.
Thanks all for that. Goran, I know you've been waiting patiently, so please.
Thank you, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, my camera is not working. But anyway, many thanks for this very, very informative discussion today. Just wanted to highlight, what's kind of our work when we did some work on the primacy was also that would be important and useful to also consider not only kind of short term, but look at the longer term, where we are moving towards. And as you know, our analysis demonstrated that not only look at the operation, but also the planning, that in fact, in some of these cases, it was cost effective, for example, to reinforce some areas in distribution networks in order to enable flexibility to support properly national, because that's where the biggest benefits were. And that was the right answer for the UK PLC. This is just to highlight that would be this example, just why it would be useful to also have a longer term timescales and see where because we are obviously moving towards different world with decarbonized energy system and so on, and how we're going to get there cost effectively is where this the flexibility can provide very significant contribution. But as I say again, kind of that it may not be cost effective to look at only kind of real time market operation, but to see how that's linked with the network development. As I mentioned, our modeling demonstrated it would be very, very cost effective to reinforce a little bit of distribution networks to enable the flexibility to provide strong flexibility to the services to national level.
Yeah, I completely agree, Goran, and I think this is particularly pertinent in the context of ED3 discussions and thinking about flexibility versus reinforcement, and maybe there are indeed sort of whole system justifications for reinforcement, and narrowly thinking about DNO optimization misses that wider value. It also relates to some work that NGED have been doing on the value of headroom that is relevant to this. So thinking about by creating headroom and giving that additional access to the whole system for wholesale and NISO services to those distributed assets may be more valuable than just running that distribution network hot. So yes, completely agree.
Thanks for that, Goran and Chris. We have 2-3 minutes left before the end of the session. Is there any other final questions from the group? It doesn't seem like it. I guess so. As I said at the beginning of the session, we will be publishing this recording on our ENA's YouTube channel. We will also upload the slides to the ENA website. And we, as usual, we'll be welcoming feedback through the Open Networks mailbox or any of our direct email addresses if you have them to hand. On the kind of session today, the content presented, always looking for constructive feedback there and anything that we can do to improve any sessions going forward. So I'd like to say thank you all for our speakers today for presenting and all of our attendees for attending. Have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you. Will you send us the link for this presentation?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please. Thank you. Yeah. Completely agree. Very, very informative today.
Thanks, Goran.
Meeting. Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Very useful. Bye.
Thank you. All the best. Bye bye.
Thank you all. Bye bye.